What about the nation's health? We're the least healthy Western country in the world. We spend twice as much as other countries and are 37th in overall health. We're 36 in life expectancy. We're behind Cuba. They're commies. 45 countries have lower infant mortality rates than us. We're the most medicated nation in the planet, with over half our population on prescription drugs. Antidepressant use alone has doubled in the last 10 years, which is one way to get through the Bush years. We're number one in obesity and number one in illegal drug use. In response, conservative Republicans want to repeal Obamacare. Look, I'm not a big fan of Obamacare, personally. I mean, you can try to hang it on me, but I think it's a very flawed bill. I'm much more for a single-payer system, so there you go. But at least Obamacare covers another 30 million people. It doesn't allow you to be dropped when you become sick. It doesn't allow you to be refused insurance for a pre-existing condition. Obamacare, which during the 90s used to be the right-wing conservative sort of alternative to Hillary care, it was called Romney care in Massachusetts. It worked fine. Where do we stand with poverty, especially poor children? There's some staggering numbers here. 40% of Americans are living in poverty right now. 40%. There's an intended consequence. 1.5 million children in America are homeless. This is just shameful. Conservatives want to cut Head Start by $5.7 billion. Progressives would never think about doing that in response to 1.5 million homeless children. Conservatives are fond of talking about personal responsibility, but you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you've been cut off by your knees. We have fallen in every educational and health and life metric in the last 30 years. What's really concerning are the results of this lack of equality, which are glaring in our economy. I'm not just talking about the worst economic collapse that we've experienced since the Great Depression. I'm talking about long-term banana republic trends that are going on right now, that are creating more poverty and lower life expectancy in the US than in any Western nation. So what do I mean specifically? Here comes some really specific numbers. In the last 30 years, as a part of some intended consequences, more than 80% of the total increase in American incomes went to the top 1%. That's a massive redistribution of wealth, all upward. So let's drill down even more. According to the Economic Policy Institute, in 1976, the top 1% earned 9% of the wealth, 9% of the income, rather, in 1976. So right now, they earn 24% of the income. So 24% of the income is going to the top 1%. You know, I was joking about Banana Republic, but actually, you become a Banana Republic when the top 1% captures 20% of the income. We're at 24%. These are just some trends that are going on. In terms of wealth, the top 1% of the US population controls 40% of the wealth, or as much as the bottom 50%. And they are buying the government with their money. Put another way, 400 people have more money than 155 million Americans combined. These are just the facts. This is what happens when you strip away the nice language. In 1980, CEO pay was 40 times the average worker. Now it's 450 times the average worker. What's the result of this income shift? America, the land of opportunity, now ranks 10th in upward mobility after many European countries, including France. We're behind France in upward mobility. That's really saying something. Another result is 100 million Americans are worse off today than their parents were. For the last 30 years, we're sliding towards an economic feudalism by an elite that has captured the government with $45 billion of lobbyist money a year. This is the reality, folks. America is in the process of getting a third world makeover. The causes of this train wreck are not unintended. They're not unintended consequences. They're Republican values and policies which can be boiled down to tax cuts for the richest, cutting opportunities for the poorest, and corporate welfare for the most powerful companies in the world. They are values that are inherently against a level playing field, values that are the opposite of compassionate, values that say that no matter how needy, it's theft to take money from the richest and use it to invest in education and health care for the poorest. They are values that won't be happy until every union is destroyed and we return to the untrammeled capitalism of the Gilded Age, when a very few lived in obscene luxury while the many toiled 18 hours a day in horrible conditions. They want to return to a time when they can externalize costs on the environment and lower wages down to third world levels. Make no mistake, this is what it means to be a conservative. So these have been some pretty sweeping statements, so let's drill down and get more specific. What's the difference between conservatives and progressives? Well, keeping in mind our main questions. What kind of country do we want to live in? And what principles will provide the most good for the most people? Unlike progressives, conservatives have been against every great social stride in America in the last 100 years. They were against women's right to vote. They were against civil rights. They were against social security, Medicare, and now against gay rights. They're quite simply always behind the curve and always need to be dragged kicking and screaming into modernity. What about economic policy? Even in this economic crisis, Republicans want unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. How's that working for us lately, guys? Conservatives are all for the invisible hand of the marketplace, except when it comes to holding Wall Street accountable, then they're all for getting their losses socialized and getting bailed out. Which brings me to the conservatives' main economic thesis, or what George Bush the Senior called voodoo economics. The idea that reducing taxes would produce more revenue, balancing the budget. 30 years of Republican tax cuts and no spending cuts, and we've gone from $1 trillion debt to $14 trillion. That's the reality. Reagan alone tripled the national debt from $1 trillion to $3 trillion. The only respite from this runaway debt and deficit was during the Clinton years, when he actually balanced the budget. It's just the facts. So let's talk budget. Unlike progressives, Republicans don't really care about the deficit. Their war on arithmetic demonstrates they will make no cuts in non-discretionary spending like defense, but want to make all the cuts in 12% of discretionary spending. So what does that mean exactly? Well, budgets, I think, are moral documents. So let's take a look at Republican morality. They want to cut $1 billion from Head Start. Children who go to Head Start are much less likely to drop out of high school. Think about the human productivity cost of that alone. They want to cut Pell Grants by $6 billion, eliminating financial aid for 1.5 million lower income students. These are just things that are cutting us off in terms of just our own, what our basic American values of upward mobility and grabbing the American dream. They want to cut $10 billion in education cuts and cost 100,000 teaching jobs. They want to cut $1 billion from a highly successful program that provides supplemental nutrition to infants and young children. In short, the Republican solution to debt is to eat our seed corn. The seed corn is the corn that you save at the end of the harvest so that you can plant for the next year. And that seed corn is our next generation of children. Progressives, on the other hand, would look for cuts elsewhere. We have a $35 billion agribusiness subsidy. We have a $93 billion that we spend every year in obsolete parts orders for just the Air Force. We have a $22 billion refundable tax credit for ethanol, which is an oil company subsidy. We have $56 billion we're spending every year for our nuclear arsenal. I know you voted for Bush, Mark, and I gotta admit, I Googled you, so I saw that you gave some money to the candidate. So I just want to continue on here a little bit about, and remind you a little bit about what has happened in the last 30 years. When Bush came in, there was a debt actually of $6 trillion. When he left, there was a debt of $11 trillion. So this is just the reality of what conservatism leads to. I mean, there's a sense of conservatives are just against the deficit, against the debt. But Bush came in, it was $6 trillion, and when he left, it was $11 trillion. These are just the reality. So how do conservatives get half the country to agree to all of this? How do you get the poor middle-class people who can't afford a doctor to vote against their own interests and deny themselves any kind of proper health care, education, or secure employment? It's quite a trick. Starting with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, Republicans have used fear and prejudice to manipulate the vote and against their own interests. They win at that game by playing social issues as a wedge, further alienating Americans from each other. We saw it in 2004 around gay rights, and we see similar tactics today around immigration and the barely concealed racism of those that just can't accept an African-American president. So when you call yourself a conservative, you are aligning yourself with a party that has been captured by its most extreme message. Thank you. Perfectly happy to let lies flourish and do nothing to disown the liars, including Sarah Palin, who has accused Obama of being a foreigner, being a Muslim, and not being a legitimate president. Let's talk guns, which Republicans hold so dearly. 100,000 shootings last year with 30,000 gun deaths. That's every year. 30,000 people get killed by guns. Over 1 million people since Martin Luther King was shot. Being anti-gun control isn't logical, but when you think about science and logic and critical thinking and the scientific method, many conservatives are anti-science and anti-global warming and are global warming deniers. They also want intelligent design. That is the idea that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago, taught in schools. They're against stem cell research. Why would Republicans be for critical thinking, logic, and reason? By appealing to fear and prejudice, they rely on the opposite to get people to vote against their own interests. Republicans don't believe in health care as a human right. Progressives do. We believe in a single-payer system where everybody's covered. It is, by the way cheaper in the long run because it's not for profit and it gets rid of 1/3 of the cost of our health care, and that's the administrative cost.